Welcome, friends. It is time, once again, to swing wide the doors of the Thriller Cabinet. Agnes, it's me, Billy. Pretty Agnes. Oh, hello there. Sorry, you've just caught me making one of my phone calls. I'll just hang up now. Anyway, I'm your host, Johnny Restall. I'm a writer. I write freelance about films and music. If you're interested in my stuff, you can find that at my Linktree, which is linktr.ee/Johnny Restall, which is JOHNNYRESTALL. On this podcast, we talk about film thrillers, and that really covers all kinds of thrillers, right across the board, basically. If it's got anything you could describe as a thrilling element, I'll probably talk about it within reason. And as you might be able to tell from that horrible impression that I did just a minute ago, I don't know where that came from, let's hope it never comes back again. Today I'm talking about Bob Clark's 1974 horror, thriller, pioneer slasher film, Black Christmas. Bob Clark was an American director, but he mainly worked in Canada, having a pretty huge impact on the Canadian film industry, certainly the Canexploitation side of that. His first couple of films were horror. In 1972 he made Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, and followed that up with a riff on the Monkey's Paw called Death Dream in 1974, before he moved over to Canada, I think initially for tax shelter reasons, as Canada was quite heavily funding films made there, giving tax breaks to them, for Black Christmas in 1974. He had nothing if not a diverse career before his untimely death in a traffic accident in 2007, going on from Black Christmas to make the excellent Sherlock Holmes Investigates Jack the Ripper, Whodunit, Murder by Decree in 1979. Also then going on to make both Porky's, the raunchy sex comedy, in 1981, and its sequel in 1983, Porky's 2. As well as that, he also crafted a Christmas film which is pretty much the polar opposite of Black Christmas, A Christmas Story in 1983, which is probably less known in the UK, really. I've never seen it myself, but is apparently a Yuletide classic in Canada and the US, and is very much loved. Black Christmas comes from a script written by the writer A. Roy Moore. Apparently it was originally called Stop Me, which is a terrible title, so I'm quite pleased they changed it, really. It's a little bit unclear exactly at what point the seasonal element came into the film. I'm not sure whether that was in Moore's original script or whether that was something to do with Clark. The cast they assembled for Black Christmas is in many ways a cult movie lover's dream, really. There's a whole host of people who've popped up in all kinds of weird and wonderful genre pictures over the years, and the film's led by Olivia Hussey, playing the main character of Jess. Hussey's an English actress. She's probably best known, I suppose, still, for being in Franco Zeffirelli's, I think, 1968 version of Romeo and Juliet, playing Juliet. But she's gone on to do an awful lot of things since, and will maybe be best known to horror movie lovers, certainly, for a couple of TV movies that she appeared in 1990, popping up in Psycho 4, The Beginning, and the original TV movie version of Stephen King's It, starring Tim Curry. Joining her in support in the film, there's Keir Dullea as her dubious boyfriend, Peter. Keir Dullea had a long career, again playing in all sorts of films, but perhaps best known for popping up in various thrillers, things like Otto Preminger's Bunny Lake is Missing in the 60s, Full Circle or The Haunting of Julia in the late 70s. But ultimately, he's really best known for his role as the astronaut Dave Bowman in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, and Peter Hyam's 1984 sequel to that, 2010, The Year We Make Contact. And if you forgive me digressing for a moment, if you're a fan of 2001 and you haven't watched 2010, I really recommend giving it a go, because it's really good. No, it's not 2001 and not quite as good as that film, but what is, but it's still a very good film in its own right. Anyway, back to this film. They're joined by Margot Kidder as Barb. Kidder's probably best known for playing Lois Lane to Christopher Reeve's Superman in the series of 4 films that were made from, I think, 1978 to 1987. She also had quite big roles in The Amityville Horror and The Great Waldo Pepper, and for our purposes as the Thriller Cabinet, she's also very notable in Brian De Palma's excellent 1972 thriller Sisters. Also appearing in a fairly small supporting role is Art Hindle, who'll probably be very familiar to genre fans of 70s cinema, having taken roles in the excellent Philip Kaufman remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1978, as well as appearing in the lead in David Cronenberg's phenomenal and very disturbing The Brood in 1979, and has worked steadily ever since. The most recent thing I think I've seen him in was popping up in a small supporting role as a policeman in 2016's The Void. And supporting all of them, or not, as the case may be, as he's something of a useless policeman, is John Saxon, a genre legend as Lieutenant Fuller. Saxon had a long career appearing in all kinds of cult B-movies, appearing in the likes of Mario Bava's The Girl Who Knew Too Much in 1963, through to things like Dario Argento's Tenebrae in the early 1980s, also making a very memorable appearance with Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon in 1973, proving surprisingly good at martial arts and kicking some ass in that film. Probably his best known role for genre fans ultimately will be as Nancy Thompson's dad, the detective in Wes Craven's seminal slasher A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984. In some ways, I think his character in that film has quite strong links to his character in Black Christmas, which we'll probably come back to in a little while. I sometimes think one might be an older version of the younger version we meet in the film we're discussing today. His association with the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise continued when he appeared in a couple of the sequels, firstly in Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors in 1987, playing the same role, and then later on as himself in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, the 1994 meta sequel cum revision. To give a very brief synopsis of Black Christmas, the story is set in a sorority house in, well, the film kind of pretends that it's the US, but it's pretty obviously in Canada. It's Christmas time and the girls are starting to leave for the holidays. The ones who are remaining are increasingly being plagued by mysterious, obscene phone calls from an unseen man. Unknown to them, we've seen someone already climbing into the house and up into the loft. As the film progresses, the body count increases and it turns out there is definitely a murderer on the loose. Now, while you could be forgiven for thinking that that sounds like 101 other slasher films, as I'm hopefully going to demonstrate as we start discussing this film in depth, there's a lot more going on than that. It turns various genre conventions on their head, and it's a much more thoughtful, sympathetic, subtle, interesting film. It's also a brilliantly made, absolutely cracking little thriller, genuinely scary, and really pays repeat viewing, which is always a good thing. As ever, this is your customary warning. There will be spoilers, extensive spoilers, in this podcast, so if you haven't watched Black Christmas, I'd urge you to go and do so. Okay, consider yourselves warned. It's time to dive in.
A high school girl's been murdered. Mr. Harrison's daughter is missing. And now at the house where she lives, the other girls are getting obscene phone calls.
Yeah, what I've done is I've tapped this phone so that when it rings, it'll ring at the station house, too.
There was a little girl murdered over in the park tonight.
Yes, I heard.
Your phone's ringing. Hello?
Hey, Mommy. There's the baby. Baby, all right, Mom. Just as well.
Who's there?
I know you're there, now, baby. You answer me, it's bad. Mommy. Come here.
Where's Agnes?
You won't.
What are you doing?
This is Graham. It's group 140, terminal 55.
Remember those idyllic scenes out of your childhood? Crisp winter nights, star bright, sleigh bells, crackling Yule logs, candlelight glistening off of shimmering Christmas trees, chestnuts roasting over open fires, carolers beneath snow-covered window ledges. Remember those. Remember them well. After Black Christmas, they'll never be the same again. Black Christmas, starring Olivia Hussey, Keir Dullea, Margot Kidder, and starring John Saxon as Lieutenant Fuller. If this movie doesn't make your skin crawl, it's on too tight.
Well, that was a very bracing trailer, wasn't it? Unexpectedly a posh voiceover man at the end too. Sounded a bit like Edward Fox to me. I didn't know he slummed it doing voiceovers for Canadian B-movies back in the day, but perhaps he did. At least it wasn't Lawrence Fox, so that's something. Nice to hear the movie's absolutely phenomenal tagline as well there. Well worth repeating here, I think. If this movie doesn't make your skin crawl, it's on too tight. Doesn't make any sense, but I love it anyway. Now, the first question that often comes up when people are discussing the original Black Christmas from 1974 is it the first slasher film? Now, you could debate that all day, really. I'm not sure I've got an answer to it. It's certainly one of the first to really set up quite a lot of the genre's tropes and style, although it subverts many of them too, particularly in terms of using a camera for the killer's point of view. That said, it certainly isn't the first film to ever do that. There's a few giallos that I can think of from Italy which touch on the killer's point of view, perhaps not in quite the same way, but do include it. And the earliest example of the killer's point of view in a film that I can think of would be quite a bit earlier in Michael Powell's infamous 1960 Peeping Tom, which opens with a scene from the killer's point of view, adding a whole meta layer to it by having it be in his point of view through a camera, so he's filming what we're watching. Certainly, however, it's one of the first to really emphasise the roving, sinister camera. Reginald H. Morris's superb cinematography in the film is constantly on the move, whether it's the killer's eye view, which is kind of connotated through a sort of, I think it's a fisheye lens that slightly distorts the image and is very unsettling and creepy. But even when it's just filming regular scenes, it's constantly moving and exploring the space, roving around. There's absolutely brilliant use of the depth of the spaces. I believe they did film it in a real house, so I don't know quite how they managed to work some of the shots, considering the huge equipment they must have been using, but somehow they do get these incredible shots with the camera moving around, and there's quite a few where the camera seems to move, instead of it moving in or out, it'll move sideways to reveal something that the character themselves may not already have seen, that somehow gives a sense of, I don't know, scale and depth to the film. Certainly it helps to cement a kind of visual style that's really popularised with John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween, which is generally credited as being the official start of the slasher boom, a style that becomes so recognisable that within a few years of that, by 1981, Brian De Palma's openly spoofing slasher movie tropes at the beginning of his brilliant thriller Blowout in 1981, where it starts with a slasher movie within a film. This takes us on to perhaps one of the more contentious areas of Black Christmas's legacy. As I've already mentioned, Halloween, there always seems to be a certain critical and filmmaker rivalry between the two films. I'm going to preface anything that I'm going to say further about it by saying that in some ways I think that's quite understandable, but quite silly. I don't see any need to rank them one against the other. I don't see any need to say one's good, one's bad. I think you're really choosing between two different shades of excellence, and that while the two films have certain things in common in terms of their style and their tone, they're also very, very different, and we'll be touching on some of those differences as I start going into the characters and themes. But to briefly touch on the more controversial aspects of it, according to the documentary Black Christmas Legacy, which is on the 101 Films Blu-ray of Black Christmas, which I have, Bob Clark is quoted in that as saying that he actually discussed a potential sequel that he was never probably going to do, but just a potential sequel idea to Black Christmas with a young John Carpenter. And he says that he told Carpenter that if he were to ever make a sequel to Black Christmas, it would be set several months later. The killer would have been institutionalized in the meantime and would escape in time for a popular October holiday, and the film would have been called Halloween. Now, Clark's version of this I've seen disputed quite vociferously by John Carpenter, who's always denied any connection between the two. In fact, I've seen a few quotes from him online where he's quite disparaging about Black Christmas, sadly. I'm paraphrasing him a little, but I think he said something along the lines of, if he learned anything from Black Christmas, it was how not to do a film. I think that's quite unfair. I don't know how seriously to take it, because if you've read many interviews with John Carpenter, he's quite grumpy. I don't think he likes being interviewed, so I'm not sure how much that reflects his real opinion and how much that's just him trying to shut down someone asking him irritating questions. In any case, the two do share a particular seasonal holiday setting and extensive use of a killer's point of view. They also share, I suppose, women being in peril from a psychopathic killer who is unknowable, although there's some very significant differences between the two, which we will be covering as we go along. Aside from its pioneering visual style, one of the things that really, really sets Black Christmas apart is its astonishing and incredibly creepy, unsettling use of sound. You probably picked up a little of that from the trailer itself, which even just the little snippets in that are genuinely unnerving. Listening back to it myself, it makes some of the hairs on my arms stand up because it's just very, very sinister. The sound editor for the film was a gentleman called Ken Healy-Rae, and it does an extraordinary job as a film of using sound, but also the lack of sound. Now, that might at first seem like an incredibly obvious point to make. I'm sure everyone listening will be familiar with the notion of films having a long silence before the big jump scare kicks in. I mean, that's something that's been around ever since Jacques Tournier's Cat People back in 1942 with the famous jump scare when the bus suddenly arrives unexpectedly. all the way through to what I'd call the current James Wan style, where there's a long silence and then a massive noise to make you jump out of your seat. However, Black Christmas, I'd say, uses the sound in a much more insidious and genuinely unnerving way that really gets under your skin. It's not a film that generally cops out with a cheap jump scare. Instead, the silence and the natural sounds that you do hear, which are quite often emphasised, they build atmosphere. They're not just decoration, and they're not just there to drop out so that there can be a sudden big noise on the soundtrack to make you jump. They're there in a way that's very ominous, in a way that just builds up bit by bit and really, really gets under your skin. The sound of the wind outside, or the silence in the house, or the contrast between children's song at the very start with that kind of natural, cosy sound being subverted by the visual sense that the camera's roving around and something bad is outside waiting to come in. As I've already mentioned, the telephone calls that they keep getting at the house are an essential part of the plot, and the ringing sound of the telephone itself, it almost becomes the score at times, almost becomes a punctuation point. Key scenes are defined by the sound of the ringing telephone, and indeed, for the final, deeply creepy silent credits, the only sound we can really hear is the wind whispering and the sound of a telephone ringing inside of the house getting louder and louder and louder. It's something of a cliche, perhaps, that when you think of a slasher movie, you probably think of a pulsating synthy score a la Halloween, say, or Slumber Party Massacre. But Black Christmas doesn't have that at all. In fact, it barely has any kind of really conventional score. Working with Carl Zitterer, the composer, who collaborated with Clarke on several films, they make a kind of sinister soundscape. It's quite avant-garde, really, deliberately manipulating sound. There's incredibly unsettling noises that I think come from a piano, kind of scraping along the strings or striking the strings, instead of having icy, synthy stabs and a kind of pulsating beat. There's just these horrible, kind of unsettling, almost gut-level rumbling noises, and it's hard to tell at times quite where the musical score and the kind of natural or Foley sound work actually begins. They seem to blend into each other in a way that's very unsettling and kind of violates your oral sense of space in a similar way to the way the camera is violating the boundaries of the house and where it should or shouldn't be going and whose perspective you should or shouldn't be seeing. The collaboration between Clarke and Zitterer builds brilliantly on the promise they showed in the earlier Death Dream, I think was filmed in 1972 but released in 1974, just before Black Christmas. That film is quite flawed, doesn't work brilliantly, but one of the best things about it is that it's got some genuinely unsettling use of sound, and boy do they build on that and go to town on it with Black Christmas. Of course, it's impossible really to talk about the use of sound in the film without starting to talk about the phone calls from the killer and the killer's voice. The killer's voice is provided by a few different people, apparently. The main person providing it is an actor called Nick Manusco, but apparently parts of it are also Bob Clarke himself. I think he apparently provides the sung parts, and all of it is slightly electronically manipulated. In the Black Christmas Legacy documentary, Zitterer talks about how they put the sound through a then cutting-edge device called the harmonizer, where you could kind of slow down or electronically alter the voices. It's an incredibly memorable part of the film and truly skin-crawling. I mean, the things the voice is saying are horrible, but that's not all of it. It's the sound of it itself. It sounds like more than one person talking, which it is at times. But there's these incredible horrible guttural sounds that run the whole gamut between kind of one moment sounding like an old woman, then it'll sound like a young child, then it'll sound like a grown man, then it'll sound like some kind of beast in agony. It's really, really, really unsettling. Apparently some editions of Black Christmas these days come with a commentary from Nick Minusco, which I think he does entirely in character. I've not heard it myself. I don't think I'd have the stomach to, because just the calls in the film are more than unsettling enough. Thanks very much. I've already touched on Black Christmas's preference for suspense over jump scares, and I think that's something that's worth exploring a little more. Hitchcock famously said that there is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it, going on to explain that you could have a scene where a bomb unexpectedly went off underneath a table. That would be surprise, but suspense would come from the audience knowing that there was a bomb under the table while the characters were oblivious to it. And Black Christmas definitely fits into that kind of mould. Right from the very start of the film, immediately after the opening credits, we see someone climbing up into the house. We know somebody is there. So it's a matter of waiting for things to happen. And it generally, as I say, avoids going for jump scares. The closest thing it has is perhaps in the first kill, the murder of Claire, played by Lynn Griffin, when she's attacked by an unseen figure who's hiding in her closet. But even that, it doesn't go for what you might expect the moment when someone just leaps out. We know before that happens that someone's there. The camera shows us that someone is looking out through the plastic and we see a hand. Shortly after that, we know exactly what they've done, the killer's done with the body when he takes it up into the attic. So we even know where exactly he is in the house for quite a bit of the film. So a huge amount of the suspense doesn't come from shocks that come from him leaping out or not knowing that he's there. It comes from knowing exactly where he is and what he's doing quite a lot of the time, and from instead wanting to scream at the characters to get out of the house, to pay attention, to stop having trivial conversations and get out. At times this almost adds a level of kind of cruel irony, almost a kind of black humour to certain scenes, as characters, we see them repeatedly miss things that they really, really need to see. The sound of a Christmas party downstairs drowns out the sound of Claire being murdered and covers up for the killer, bold as you like, making his way across the landing, carrying her body up to the attic. Later on, the sound of a children's choir arriving at the door to sing carols covers up the sound of Barb being brutally murdered. The camera repeatedly shows us the trapdoor to the attic opening, or even, as we've discussed, follows the killer around as he moves around the house, watching people, or alternatively, the roving kind of omniscient camera, rather than the killer's eye view, will move to the side to show us something, say some feet coming down the stairs behind one of the characters who doesn't realise that they're there. Characters repeatedly miss the danger or misread the warning signs. A busybody character rushes up to the door to usher the carolling children away, for example, because there's been a killing in the area. So she knows there's danger, but at the same time, she then blissfully turns to Jess, who's the person she's speaking to in the doorway, and says, "Oh, your phone's ringing," without realising that the phone has been the source of sinister activity all along. And even Jess doesn't know exactly what the final twist with the phone calls will prove to be. Even authority figures, or perhaps even especially authority figures, are remarkably useless in the film at actually diagnosing what's wrong, which is something that we will be coming to as we get into talking about the characters, and discussing in more depth the cruel ironies and the sharp satire that's also behind aspects of the film. Before moving on to that, I think it's also worth touching on Bob Clark's subtle but genuinely nightmarish and horrifying approach to the violence in the film, something it shares, I think, with his later Murder by Decree in 1979. The violence that you see on screen is truly horrifying, but it's never particularly gory or explicit. It's nightmarish, but again, it more comes from atmosphere and sound and something slightly surreal about it. Very unsettling angles and just something incredibly upsetting about it emotionally without ever being gory. I'd say the violence in it shares a subtlety of violence with Halloween, the original film, although I'd say Black Christmas is probably more disturbing in its violence, and it's arguably more disturbing than what you might expect from later slasher films. I mean, famously post-1980s Friday the 13th, they tended to open up the gore and the gruesomeness of the kills, but very few of those films, as ingenious as they are, quite manage to catch the emotional distress and the real sense of horror that Bob Clark gets over so well in this film. He really creates some extraordinarily horrible but memorable images in the film, and horrible in the sense of getting to you emotionally, not in the sense of gory. So, for example, there's a incredibly memorable close-up of the killer's eye, the only time that we really get a good look at him, and we'll be discussing that in a little while. But perhaps most memorably is Claire's horrible fate, left up in the attic, sat in a rocking chair with a plastic bag wrapped round her face, asphyxiated, being rocked back and forwards, or just sat in the window. It's really macabre without being especially gruesome. There's just something truly weird and nightmarish about it. Just that image is really haunting. This frozen face, wrapped in plastic, staring sightlessly out of the window, undiscovered at the top of the house. It's really horrible and very powerful, to the point that, along with the shot of the killer's eyes, it's almost become kind of an icon of the film. It features quite prominently on a lot of the posters these days. It was on the original poster, I believe, with a garland of Christmas ivy around it, which is really horrible design, but incredibly effective. We've already touched on the black humour that's there in elements of the film, but it also utilises outright comedy at times to throw its sense of horror, I think, into even sharper relief. It's almost got quite a vulgar sense of humour. A lot of the comedy is quite bawdy, like generally quite a lot of the things that Barb says, played by Margot Kidder, for example, when she's telling the idiot policeman, Sergeant Nash, that the house number is something fellatio, which is, she claims, is a new directory, FE. Or the drunken anecdote about mating turtles that she tells to Claire's disapproving father. Indeed, Claire's distinctly uptight and very square father, Mr. Harrison, played by James Edmund, is repeatedly the butt of the jokes near the start of the film. It's ended up being quite cruel. He's introduced getting his glasses knocked off by getting a snowball in the face, which seems quite classicist to me. Along with the policeman, many of the jokes are at his expense, although he perhaps becomes a more sympathetic character as the film goes on. The film certainly has a streak of irreverent humour, at least in its opening stages, that's perhaps best summed up by Patrick, the boyfriend of one of the girls at the house, played by Michael Rapport, dressed as Santa Claus at a children's party, saying "ho, ho, ho, shit" to a bunch of little children. It's quite near the knuckle and kind of jarring, although you can perhaps retrospectively see where Bob Clark's later work on Porky's was going to come from. It works surprisingly well in the film, though. Certainly in its first third, where it's kind of used as a little bit of a distraction and a way to ease the mounting tension before increasingly the humour drops out of the film and the horror takes over. The humour and its kind of out-of-placeness in the film also helps to create a real sense of something anarchic about the film and something unpredictable that gives way to an increasing sense that anything might be going to happen and that it's not going to play by any already established rules. I mean, as we've discussed a little already, it helps to set up a lot of the slasher rules, but it also undermines an awful lot of them, and that's what we're going to be discussing as we come on to the characters. One of Black Christmas's strengths, and one of the things that really sets it apart from the myriad films that followed it and bore its influence to some degree, is the strength of its characters. On the surface, its sorority house setting seems ripe for a fairly sleazy exploitation film, but that really isn't what you get in this film at all. We've already mentioned the way the camera prowls around, but I think it's a crucial difference that in this film the camera never leers at the female actresses. There's no gratuitous nudity. There's no moments when they take their clothes off for no particular reason to go skinny dipping because it's the middle of the night and there's a killer around, so why wouldn't you take all of your clothes off? There's absolutely none of that. It really refuses to exploit their sexuality. That's not to say that the film is prudish at all. We've already discussed that the humour is quite vulgar and quite sexual in places, and as we'll come on to in a moment, one of the main subplots involving Jess's pregnancy takes a very adult approach to a sexual issue. So it doesn't avoid that, but it does not exploit it. The girls in the sorority house are well-rounded and generally likeable, sympathetic characters that we actually grow to care for. They come over as if they could actually be real people, as opposed to the much more one-dimensional depiction of teenagers and young people that you might expect from a standard slasher. Jess, the lead character, and Phil, played by Andrea Martin in particular, genuinely come over as being kind and caring and being genuinely good friends. They come across that they genuinely care for each other and try to look after each other. And even Barb, played by Margot Kidder, who's a more complicated character perhaps, you can tell that they actually do like her and there's a relationship and they get on, even if she is a pain in the backside in some ways, even if she is kind of a difficult person. She has moments of vulnerability and there's clearly more going on with the character. There's effort put in to make them feel like they're living, breathing people. And that perhaps plays into what I was talking about earlier with the emotional impact of the violence too. You do actually care and you're sorry for the girls when they're killed, as opposed to some slashers where the characters are so obnoxious you almost end up rooting for the killers. I mean, even the briefest appearance, say Claire, for example, the first victim, she's barely in the film, but she's very sympathetically depicted, and she's done absolutely nothing to deserve what happens to her. It's awful, and you really feel that. In some ways, the film does manage to have its cake and eat it, because while the characters are sympathetic, they're also victim to some very cruel ironies of fate in the film. For example, Jess and Phil shouldn't even be at the house by the end. They were supposed to have left. They've only stayed behind to try and support Barb because they're good friends, and they end up paying a pretty horrible price for that, really. Likewise, Jess is the nominal heroine and she does survive through the film, so you could argue that it doesn't punish her for her choices, but I suppose you could maybe argue that that's overlooking the fact that the film has got a very bleak ending, which ultimately leaves her chances of survival not looking very good. But it's worth pointing out that that's something that's disturbing and sad in the film, rather than something that leaves you not caring, or, as I was suggesting earlier, almost going, well, good, I didn't like that character anyway. Which certainly separates it from some, not all, but some of the slashers that follow it, where the characters are basically just fodder for the killer, and it's almost impossible to care about them because they're so two-dimensionally depicted. Infamously, the slasher genre is often accused of being very conservative and reactionary and quite misogynist, with varying degrees of accuracy, but certainly there are certain films out there you could make a case that they actively punish their characters, particularly the female characters, if they're sexually active or interested in sex. There's the idea that the lead girl should be virtuous in inverted commas and virginal, which I suppose goes back to Halloween, which is, I mean, inevitably I suppose that's a much bigger influence on the slasher genre after, because it was a much bigger hit than Black Christmas was at the time. I think it's worth noting John Carpenter himself always said it wasn't his intention to make a film where teenagers were punished for having sex and only the one who wasn't having sex would survive. Regardless of his intentions, however, Halloween did have a huge influence, and whether he wanted it to or not, it set a certain kind of grimly moralistic tone for some of the slashers that followed. My overall point here, though, is that Black Christmas actively goes against the grain with that, and that's really embodied in the character of Jess and her pregnancy. It's made quite clear in the film that Jess is obviously having a sexual relationship with her boyfriend Peter, played by Keir Dullea, and that she's fallen pregnant. However, the film absolutely does not judge her for this or suggest that she's in any way a wanton person or a bad person or in any way deserving of punishment. If anything, it seems to really be on her side when she decides that she doesn't want to have the baby, and makes no attempt to condemn her for making that choice and for deciding that she wants to live her own life and not just give in to what the men around her want. If anything, Jess is portrayed in a very positive light, while her boyfriend Peter is far more unreliable and selfish and unstable. Jess is thoughtful, pragmatic and calm, where Peter is needy and difficult and quite menacing at times. He's also quite remarkably lacking in self-awareness. At one point he berates Jess, "Don't you ever think of anybody else?" And then in the very next breath starts telling her off because he's saying, "Don't you realise how important today was for me?" because his musical exam has not gone well. All he's thinking about is himself and his own career, which he then decides he wants to give up, and then assumes that Jess should just give up what she wants to do as well at the same time. He very much comes in and announces to Jess what she should do. You know, we're going to get married and we're going to do this. And Jess very reasonably fights back against that and pushes against him, and says that it isn't what she wants and that she won't marry him and she doesn't want to keep the baby. If there's a flaw in the relationship as it's depicted in that film, it's perhaps that you don't really understand why Jess would have ever got with him in the first place, because he really comes over as generally being a massive dick. Jess is helped in her strength by good, supportive friends around her. I suppose I'm particularly thinking of Phil, who's always kind and loyal to her. At one point, quite openly saying that she's never much liked Peter anyway, and there's no sense that the film is going to condemn her for her decisions. I mean, ultimately that's reflected by the fact that Jess overall is the heroine and final girl, if you like, where Peter increasingly becomes more and more sinister as the film goes on, and for a while at least it looks as if he might actually be the killer. It's worth noting, I think, at this point, another very clever thing that the score does. After Peter's rehearsal goes badly, his musical exam rather, he smashes up the piano in the concert hall. That, musically, recreates the exact sound, or almost the exact sound, that's been the killer's music all the way through the film. So, in a subtle, almost subliminal way, the music and those sounds are helping to mislead us into thinking that Peter is the killer. Ultimately, as it turns out, he almost certainly isn't, in a further cruel irony that the film provides, although he's certainly quite sinister and acting very strangely by the time he meets his demise. I suppose you could try and argue that the fact that Peter is ultimately not the killer, and is perhaps, you could see him as another victim, undermines a feminist view of the film, but I don't think it really does. In many ways, Peter reminds me of Humphrey Bogart's character in Nicholas Ray's 1950 film noir, In a Lonely Place. If you've not seen that, close your ears for 30 seconds because there's going to be a spoiler. In that film, Humphrey Bogart's character, Dick Steele, is accused of a murder. Ultimately, by the end of the film, we find out that he is not the murderer, but by that point, he's nearly strangled his new love interest, played by Gloria Graham, to death. So ultimately, the point there is not really whether or not he is the killer, but that he could be, because he shares that insecurity and jealousy and rage. And I think Peter perhaps suffers from exactly the same thing. His characterisation seems to fit into the overall anti-paternal, if you like, tone of the film, which is certainly very critical of paternalistic authority and men thinking they know best and talking over the women. That's further embodied really by the incompetent police, particularly, I suppose, Sergeant Nash, played by Douglas McGrath, who is just a moron who gets every possible thing wrong, sometimes to comic effect, but increasingly to fairly fatal effect. But even Lieutenant Fuller, played by John Saxon, he's a deeply flawed character who fails to understand anything really in the story. He does not take the disappearance of Claire seriously at all. At first, they're very much along the lines of just saying, oh, well, you know, she's a college girl, she's probably just run off with her boyfriend. They're not interested. They only become interested from two things, from a young girl's body being found dead in the park, and from Claire's boyfriend, Chris, played by Art Hindle, coming in and shouting at them a bit, and he's a local who knows some of them. So again, the police only really become involved in it, or interested in the case, at the point where locals are involved. So there's a certain class thing there where they're not interested in the college students because, you know, they're all silly college students, they don't care, blah, blah, blah. And secondly, that they need a local man to come in and shout at them before they'll actually do anything about it. Further, Sergeant Fuller overlooks a great many things and gets a huge amount wrong in the film. I mean, he laughs at and belittles Nash, but he never ever does anything about Nash. Nash is still in post at the end of the film, still being an idiot. Ultimately, Lieutenant Fuller himself is of little more use. When he goes to the house, he's told specifically about the other phone which is in the house, which we'll later find out is where the obscene phone calls are coming from. It's him who actively dismisses that idea completely out of hand, and then instead tries to reassure the girls in the house that there's a policeman sat outside guarding them, so they'll be fine. That policeman outside turns out to be worse than useless, getting killed off screen, quite abruptly achieving absolutely nothing. Fuller seems more interested in asking the girls humiliating questions about their private lives than in actually really solving anything, and he's quick to leap to the conclusion that Peter's the murderer incorrectly at the end, to the point that the police are so incompetent that they leave confident that they've got their murderer, or rather that Jess has killed their murderer for them, leaving her on her own in the house, completely vulnerable. On top of that, not only have they missed the real killer, they've still not even searched the house properly. They still haven't found Claire's body, which has been sat up in the attic along with Mrs. Max for the vast duration of the film. So even once they know the killer was in the house, they still don't even search it properly. It certainly presents a damning view overall of male authority figures, their incompetence, their inability to listen, and their inability to take female concerns seriously. In some ways, you could perhaps argue that the killer is the ultimate embodiment of the kind of controlling sexism of the male characters in the film. He breaks into the house to watch the girls and slowly starts to kill them one by one, taking them up to the attic, where he's sort of assembling some kind of weird makeshift family unit that he seems to be in charge of, rocking them backwards and forwards and having his babyish tantrums. He seems to want to possess them as pretty objects, if you like, but he's not interested in communicating with them in anything other than the most degrading and obscene terms. He rants and raves at them impotently, and then when that doesn't work for him, he decides he's going to kill them. He just resorts to violence. He insists, or appears to insist, on identifying himself to them, as if that's somehow important too, that he's a little man who needs to be recognised when he keeps saying that, "It's me, Billy." With all of that said, however, it's quite hard to read too much into the killer's character or motivations, in that we never even see him, and it's debatable perhaps whether his name is Billy. At another point in the film, earlier, we hear him repeat one of the things that Peter says to Jess about the baby, that she's treating an abortion like having a wart removed. So maybe, other than setting up another link between the killer and Peter, maybe he just parrots things. Maybe his name isn't Billy. I mean, we never even see him beyond his eye in the doorway, which just shows a kind of manic ecstasy of terror, almost as though he's got absolutely no control over anything that he's doing, and his unknowability ultimately remains a very frightening and quite a unique thing about him in terms of slasher movie villains. I mean, you think of most slasher films, think of Michael Myers, say, or Jason Voorhees or Freddy Krueger. You can debate how knowable they are, in inverted commas, but you still objectively know that's who that person is. You never do know that with the killer in Black Christmas, so perhaps I shouldn't get too carried away with reading too much into his character. The ambiguity is ultimately part of what helps to keep the film so frightening and so intriguing. So, to start to bring things to a conclusion, what is the overall influence of Bob Clark's 1974 Black Christmas? We've already discussed at some length its quiet but quite large impact on the slasher movie genre afterwards. Obviously not as big as Halloween, but certainly one that's exerted a subtle influence that's grown and grown over the years. It's fair to say it's not the first thriller or horror to be set at Christmas by any means. I mean, there's a long tradition of Christmas ghost stories going back to Victorian times and arguably before then. Plus you've got things like the likes of 1972's Amicus Tales from the Crypt, so a couple of years previously, with a sinister segment set at Christmas. So it's not the first film to subvert a festive season in that way, but it's one of the first to really do it quite as prominently, leading on to later slashers, things like Silent Night, Deadly Night. You could even say it's popped up into things like Gremlins that completely subvert the holiday season. There have been 2 remakes of Black Christmas since. In 2006, Glenn Morgan helmed a remake. a fairly loose remake, set in a sorority house again, but with a very different tone and quite a different angle to it overall. It wasn't particularly well received. It's picked up a bit of a cult following since, but it's not particularly to my taste, to be honest. It goes for a much more camp tone, I would say, much more self-aware and camp, and the characters are much more kind of mean and cynical and sassy. It feels very much like a post-Scream horror, if you like, and not in my opinion, a particularly successful one. A further remake came from Blumhouse in 2019. I have to admit, I've not seen that remake. It seemed to be fairly tepidly received. As far as I can tell from the trailer, it seems to go in a direction more of a kind of frat house conspiracy against the sorority sisters. But I don't want to say too much about that, as I haven't seen it. If you have seen it, feel free to let me know what you thought of it. I'd be very interested to hear whether it's worth watching or not. So, I think that probably brings us to the end of another episode of The Thriller Cabinet. It's for me to thank you very much for listening. It's always appreciated. If you've enjoyed this episode, it'd be very kind if you were to leave a rating or a review on the platform where you found this. That would be very nice. If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find The Thriller Cabinet at Thriller Cabinet on Instagram. You can also find me under Johnny Restall still on Twitter/X, and I'm also on Blue Sky now these days. So, until next time, thank you for listening, happy Christmas, and I'll see you next year.